Long before the name Yahweh echoed in temples, hymns, and holy scrolls, another name ruled the heavens, El. In the forgotten dawn of the ancient Near East, before monotheism took root, El was revered as the highest of the gods, the wise father seated upon a mountain throne, presiding over a divine council. Beneath him were the lesser deities, Baal, Asherah, and Yahweh. Yes, Yahweh once stood among others. The Israelites, who would one day call Yahweh their only God, once spoke the name El with reverence. It lives on even now, carved into their very identity. Israel means El rules, or God prevails. In the earliest Hebrew writings, you'll find his name everywhere. El Elyon, the Most High. El Shaddai, the Almighty. But something extraordinary happened over centuries of retelling and rewriting. El did not disappear overnight. He was slowly eclipsed, not erased, but merged. The God of old faded from the manuscripts until only one remained, Yahweh. And that raises a profound question. How does a supreme deity vanish without a trace? Or perhaps, how does another God quietly take his place? When we turn to the oldest layers of Scripture, the fragments preserved before later editors reshaped them, a very different picture emerges. In Deuteronomy 32:8, for example, the ancient text reads, "When the Most High, El Elyon, divided the nations, he fixed their boundaries according to the number of the sons of God." Here, El Elyon stands as the divine sovereign, and Yahweh is but one of the many gods assigned to rule over a particular people, in this case, Israel. Yahweh was a guardian deity, a regional protector, not the creator of all. But over time, this verse, like so many others, was altered. The sons of God became sons of Israel. The plural gods vanished from sight. Yahweh was raised higher, El was folded into him, and history began to forget that there had ever been two. It wasn't erasure, it was transformation, a merging so seamless that by the time the final texts were compiled, even the scribes may not have noticed the full extent of what they had done. Yet Yahweh's beginnings lie not in Canaan's heartland, nor in Jerusalem's hills. They lie far to the south, in the barren deserts of Seir, Edom, and Teman. Deuteronomy 33:2 and Judges 5:4 describe Yahweh as coming from Seir, the rugged highlands of nomadic tribes. And deep within Egyptian records from the 13th century BCE, we find mention of a people called the Shasu of Yu. These were desert wanderers who worshipped a storm god named Yahweh long before Israel ever existed. So, Yahweh was not born in the temples of Israel. He came from the wilderness. To the Shasu nomads, he was the god of thunder, of storms and battle, a fierce protector against the chaos of the desert. He was not the creator of the universe. He was the god of survival. But how did this tribal storm deity ascend to the throne of heaven itself? The answer lies in a slow and deliberate evolution, or rather a theological merger. As Yahweh's following spread northward into the Canaanite world, his image began to shift. He was absorbed into the grand pantheon ruled by El, and eventually, he took El's place. Archaeologists and historians studying the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint have confirmed that in the earliest Hebrew traditions, El Elyon, not Yahweh, was the supreme being. El divided the nations among divine sons, and Yahweh received Israel. But later versions edited this hierarchy out, crafting a new image, one where Yahweh stood alone. Gradually, the titles once belonging to El, Most High, Creator, Everlasting, were transferred to Yahweh. His name began to replace El's in older stories, until they became indistinguishable. It was a quiet revolution, one not fought with swords, but with ink. In the age before Yahweh's rise, El was the father of the gods, the eternal ruler seated atop his holy mountain, surrounded by his divine court. The Ugaritic texts describe him as a wise and merciful king, the very image of divine authority. This concept deeply influenced the early Israelites, whose culture grew out of that same Canaanite soil. The evidence is still hidden in plain sight, in the names of places and people. Israel, El rules. Bethel, house of El. Even El Shaddai, the name by which Abraham knew God, appears long before the name Yahweh is ever spoken. In Genesis 17:1, El Shaddai appears to Abraham, not Yahweh. At this point in history, El was the God of the patriarchs, the source of covenant and blessing. Yahweh's name is absent from these early stories because he had not yet taken center stage. For a time, both El and Yahweh existed side by side, one the high creator, the other a divine warrior of Israel. But soon, their identities began to intertwine. The merging of El and Yahweh wasn't sudden. It unfolded in layers across generations of scribes. Early texts like Genesis 33:20 show Jacob building an altar named El, the God of Israel, a phrase that curiously blends two separate beings into one, as if the authors themselves were caught between worlds. By Exodus 6:3, the transformation is nearly complete. Yahweh tells Moses, "I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh, I was not known to them." This verse is a quiet admission. The patriarchs once worshipped El, but now Yahweh claims El's identity as his own. The scribes had done their work. The names remained, but their meanings had shifted. Yahweh's story absorbed El's attributes, his creation, his wisdom, his title of Most High. The transformation wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, a systematic rebranding of divinity. El faded from worship, but his shadow lived on within Yahweh's name. Yet Yahweh's path to supremacy didn't end with El. Another god stood in his way, Baal, the storm god of Canaan. Long before Yahweh's thunder rolled through the Psalms, it was Baal who commanded the clouds, who rode the storm chariot, who conquered the chaotic sea. Cities like Ugarit and Tyre sang his praises, calling him rider on the clouds. But as Yahweh's image evolved, it began to mirror Baal's. The same lightning, the same thunder, the same victory over the sea, all the hallmarks of Baal's power, were gradually rewritten into Yahweh's mythology. Psalm 29, for instance, almost perfectly mirrors ancient hymns to Baal. But the name has been changed. Now the voice of Yahweh thunders over the waters. How do you defeat a rival god? Not by erasing him, but by becoming him. Over time, Yahweh inherited Baal's crown while condemning his name. And in Israel's new theology, there could be no second storm god. So Baal was recast as an enemy, a false idol, silenced by fire from heaven in the story of Elijah. It was not just a story. It was a declaration of supremacy. Yahweh now ruled the storm, and Baal was history. But Yahweh had yet another companion, in the shadows, one who shared his altar before being erased from memory. Her name was Asherah Archaeological. Finds from a remote desert site called Kuntilat Ajrud revealed inscriptions dating to the 8th century BCE that read, "Blessed be you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah." This was no coincidence. It appeared more than once. To the early Israelites, Yahweh was not alone. He had a divine consort, the same Asherah once worshipped beside El, the mother of the gods and goddess of fertility. If Yahweh had merged with El, then Asherah, El's wife, naturally followed. For centuries, her presence was part of Israelite worship. Wooden poles and sacred trees dedicated to her were common, but as the push toward exclusive Yahweh worship grew stronger, Asherah's name became dangerous. Under King Josiah in the 7th century BCE, her altars were torn down, her symbols burned, and her name branded as heresy. The priests called it purification. But it was more than that. It was a purge. Even the Hebrew word Asherah, once meaning a sacred symbol, became a warning label. The feminine divine was silenced, her memory woven out of Scripture. Yet archaeology tells a different story, one where Yahweh and Asherah were worshipped side by side, king and queen of heaven. So how did Yahweh's solitary reign truly begin? The answer lies in the reign of King Josiah, the monarch who reshaped Israel's religion forever. According to 2 Kings 22-23, Josiah discovered a mysterious Book of the Law hidden within the temple, a text many scholars identify as an early form of Deuteronomy. What followed was nothing short of revolutionary. Josiah launched a campaign to eliminate every trace of polytheism. Altars outside Jerusalem were destroyed. Priests of other deities were executed. The worship of Asherah and Baal was outlawed. Worship was centralized. One God, one temple, one people. But behind this religious reform was a political strategy. Josiah's scribes weren't simply documenting faith, they were shaping national identity. The message was clear: Yahweh alone was Israel's God, and Jerusalem was his dwelling place. It was the dawn of monotheism, born from fire, blood, and rewritten scripture. Archaeological layers from that era tell a silent story of smashed idols, burnt shrines, and temples rebuilt to honor one name alone. Yahweh had not risen through consensus. He had risen through reform, through a top-down redefinition of faith itself. And though Josiah would die young, his theological revolution would live on, solidified by the scribes who rewrote history in his name. Then came the catastrophe that would redefine everything. In 586 BCE, Jerusalem fell to Babylon. The temple, the very house of Yahweh, was reduced to rubble. The priests were scattered, the people enslaved, and the God who was supposed to protect them seemed silent. But instead of abandoning Yahweh, something unexpected happened. In the ashes of defeat, the Israelites reinvented their God. No longer a local deity tied to one land or temple, Yahweh became a cosmic ruler, a God of justice who used Babylon itself as an instrument of divine punishment. The narrative changed. Israel wasn't defeated because Yahweh was weak, but because they had sinned. It was a theological pivot that turned tragedy into destiny, and in exile, something profound occurred. With no temple to bind their worship, Yahweh's presence became universal. His power stretched beyond Israel's borders, beyond the stars. The scribes began to gather ancient stories and edit them into a single grand theology. Old fragments were reshaped, contradictions removed, plural gods erased. Through careful redaction, Yahweh became all in all. In this new vision, creation was no longer a council's work, it was Yahweh's alone. The plural voice in Genesis, "Let us make man in our image," became a mystery rather than a memory. Books like Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy were restructured to reflect the triumph of a single deity. What had once been divine pluralism was now divine singularity. By the time of the prophet Isaiah, the transformation was complete. Yahweh declared, "I am the first and the last. Besides me there is no God." The storm god of the desert had become the universal creator, the sole ruler of heaven and earth. And the memory of El, Baal, Asherah, and the rest faded into myth. This was not just the birth of a god, it was the birth of an idea: monotheism. A revolution not of conquest, but of belief. A faith rewritten to serve a nation rebuilding its soul. Yet even after all these centuries, the traces of El still linger like whispers through ancient names and scriptures. Israel, El rules. Bethel, House of El Shaddai, the Almighty. These names remind us of an older faith, a time before Yahweh stood alone. In the earliest layers of the Hebrew Bible, El was still distinct, El Elyon, the Most High. But through centuries of redaction, his name, his traits, and his power were quietly folded into Yahweh's identity. What was once two became one. What was once a pantheon became a singular throne. History was rewritten, not through destruction, but through absorption. By the time the final form of the Hebrew Bible emerged, Yahweh had become the embodiment of all that came before him, the warrior of the desert, the father of the heavens, the stormbringer, the judge of nations. He was El, Baal, and Yahweh, all merged into one name. When we read today's Bible, it feels seamless: one God, one story, one truth. But beneath the pages lies an ancient tapestry of belief systems stitched together by generations of scribes, priests, and kings. They didn't destroy the old gods. They rewrote them into one. Every title Yahweh bears today, El Elyon, El Shaddai, Lord of Hosts, King of Heaven, was once shared among many deities of the ancient world. But through centuries of faith, reform, and exile, these divine fragments fused into a single being. It's one of the most remarkable transformations in human history, the evolution of belief itself. So now, when you read the sacred texts and hear the name Yahweh, remember, he was not always alone. He rose from the dust of many gods, absorbing their stories, their powers, and their myths, until no rivals remained. From El's throne to Baal's storm, from Asherah's sanctuary to the desert shrines of Seir, all roads led to one name. And from that name, a new world of faith was born. This was not just the making of a god, it was the rewriting of divinity itself. What do you think? Was Yahweh's rise the natural evolution of faith, or a carefully orchestrated transformation of history? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed exploring this hidden chapter of ancient belief, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories of our forgotten past. Stay curious and keep your mind open.